how to make Anna's travel dress from the movie Frozen 2 using 2 men's button-up shirts, some trim, and your sewing machine. Please like and follow my sewing channel for lots of fun ideas. The supplies you'll need are either brown fabric or some brown single fold 1/2 inch bias binding. Then I decided to use some brown trim for the sleeves. It's kind of a crocheted trim with ribbon through it, and she has a detail on her sleeves, and that's how I did that detail. Then I have a black button-up shirt that the collar is already removed because I used it in another tutorial, and then you use a yellow button-up shirt also. So the first thing I did was I took my seam ripper and I took off the collar part of the collar. So that's the part that's at the top, and I left the collar stand. That's where the button is, and that way you can have a nice collar and you didn't have to sew a collar all by yourself. So I removed that, and this shirt had the button in the back to keep the collar down, and it also had the 2 front buttons. So I removed all of those 3 buttons to have a really clean look. Then you need to top stitch around the top of that collar so that it's now closed. Use matching thread so that you can't tell that you closed that up. Next, I decided to add some stitching detail around the collar. I have a machine that does some unique stitches, but you can just use a zigzag stitch, and I did a metallic thread all the way around the top of the collar to make it look like Anna's the top of her dress. I'm trying to show you how the stitching doesn't really show up in the video, but there is a stitching all the way around the edge of the collar. Then you are going to lay your shirt out flat, button up all the buttons so it's nice and flat and everything is where it's in its natural place. And I took one of my daughter's shirts and placed it on the collar, and it was a guide to find the top square part of Anna's dress. So she has a black dress, and the top of it has a yellow neck, a yellow collar, and then kind of a yellow square neckline. So I used this yellow button-up shirt to create that neckline, and so this shirt is my guide, and I just kind of cut a square down into the shirt. Make sure that you go in between 2 buttons instead of cutting through a button. And then I folded it in half to match everything up to, and I was making sure that one side wasn't bigger than the other side. So as you can see, once I fold it all up, one side is actually a little bit bigger. I cut it a little off, and so I just went through and straightened that up, and that makes it so that it's equal on both sides. And the embroidery, like that special stitching that I did, is still on the collar, and I didn't have to do the whole shirt. It was just at the top where this little yellow square section would be. Then take your black button-up shirt, and you might still have the collar on, which is fine, but button all the buttons down the front of the shirt and lay it out nice and flat and smooth. Make sure everything is in its natural place. Then I took the same shirt, my daughter's shirt, and I placed it over the neckline, and this is how I cut out the black bodice of the shirt. So it was just kind of a guess, and since this is kind of a dress up, I'm not too worried about the shape as long as it's not too tight. I just did kind of a sleeve curve, and then I did a waist length bodice. You can use a pattern as a guide for this part if you'd like. And then make sure when you cut across that you're cutting in between 2 buttons instead of cutting through a button. And then I folded mine in the center, and I cut the other side so that it was matching on both sides. Then you are going to cut the skirt, and I just used the rest of the bottom of the shirt to make the whole skirt, and make sure you cut through the middle of 2 buttons. I am doing about a size 6 dress, so this it was either a medium or a large button-up shirt. Worked great for this size of a dress. If you have someone that's a little bit bigger, you might have to use 2 button-up shirts. And if it's someone smaller, then, you know, you could use a smaller button-up shirt. But that's how I got my bodice and my skirt from the black button-up shirt. And you have the nice button-up front on both the skirt and the bodice. And for the sleeves, I closed the cuff, and what I did is I folded it right on the seam line. The shirt is folded on the seam line on the bottom, and I put the shirt sleeves right sides together on top of each other, and then I used my daughter's shirt as a guide for the sleeve. And I wanted to reuse the cuff, so I didn't actually cut through the cuff, but I placed the sleeve on as a guide. You'll see once I start cutting. So I did a curve for the sleeve, just like that, and then I cut down, but I just cut into the seam, and it kind of creates a dart, which it's not the perfect sleeve shape, but it makes it so I don't have to redo the cuff, and it will work just fine for a long sleeve. So now I take my bodice and I am putting my yellow detail, my yellow button-up shirt piece on top of the black bodice. I'm lining up the collar so that it's right in the same place. It's 2 different sizes of shirts, and so I can't really use the seams like on the shoulder as a guide. But right now I'm just putting it flat on top so that it's in the right place, and I can tell that it's equal on both sides and it's even, and that the buttons in the front are lined up. The one thing I changed while I was sewing is that right here it's pinned with the button plackets closed, and I ended up opening that when I sewed it so that you can still open it to wear it. Once I have it all pinned on flat, I went around and I folded the raw edge under a 1/2 inch and pinned it so that I could get the nice look without doing, you know, a really hard seam. So the corners are folded to have those in place. And just remember that my button placket is closed, but it will be a lot easier if you keep yours open and have it just pinned across open. And since the button placket is a finished seam, you don't have to, it's a finished edge, you won't have to worry about it, you know, fraying or something. You can just have it sewn right there on top. Once I had it all pinned on, I top stitched 1/8 from the edge around the whole thing, and I used the same yellow thread that I did the embroidery. And remember that my button placket is open, and that means so now I can close it. I can use the buttons to open and close the dress, and you get that nice yellow squared neckline detail without sewing hard square seams. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to cut out the black neckline of the bodice, and I'm leaving about a 1-inch seam allowance between the stitching and the fabric, and this is so I can go through and serge it or zigzag it, and there won't be that extra bulk inside. So I went through and I have a serger, so I serged that raw edge, but you can also zigzag it. The next thing you're going to do is, with right sides together, you are going to sew the side seams of the bodice. I just did a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so stitch it and then finish the raw edges. Now with the sleeves, I'm going to add that brown trim as the detail on the sleeves that Anna has on her sleeves, and I'm just pinning it as a straight line from the top center of the sleeve down, and I cut it right in the middle of the cuff, and I left a raw edge because I added detail later that actually covers up that raw edge. And it's nice. Your cuff is closed, and so, I mean, it's still a loop, and so it's a little hard to sew it on, but you can do it. You just have to kind of move your sleeve around as you're sewing it in the sewing machine. So do that to both sleeves, and then either create your own or use a 1/2 inch single fold bias tape and fold over so it's not raw, and then just sew it around the cuff. I stopped at the button and I didn't have it go over the buttonhole. I just had it on the top of the cuff, and that will cover up the raw edge of that trim. So you have a nice brown detail going down your sleeve and across the cuff. Then turn your sleeve right side in and line up that sleeve. It kind of looks like that seam, it kind of looks like a dart, and you're going to sew that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. So do that to both sleeves. Then turn them right side out, and you can see how once you button that cuff, you can see that the sleeves still work and the cuff works, and you have kind of a weird shaped seam, but no one's gonna see it and it will work just fine. Then turn your bodice right side out, and you are going to sew the sleeves into the bodice, match up the sleeve seam with the side seam of the bodice, and then pin it around all the way around the sleeve. I found that my sleeve was a little bit bigger, so I added some pleats at the top. You can also add gathering, and I did that just so that the sleeve would have a lot of extra room for play and movement. Then you're going to take the skirt portion of the black dress, and you are going to unbutton it and sew a basting stitch around the top. I did 2 rows of basting stitches so that I can gather it. So I take my skirt that has a gathering stitch and I match up the button placket on each side of the front with right sides together. So I pin that together, and then I actually pinned the side seams together, and then I pinned the other button placket together, so I have these points matched up. And then I went through and I gathered that skirt onto the bodice, and it's probably 2 times as big as the bodice, the skirt is. So it's a lot of gathering and it's a lot of work to gather that in, but make sure that your gathers are even and that it looks good. Sew that seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. So now you have your dress and it's done. You can see that the skirt is attached and your button placket still is functioning across the front of the dress. Now we're going to add some trim details. So I cut a bunch of 8-inch pieces of the single fold 1/2 inch bias tape, and I cut 8 of those, 4 for the front and 4 for the back. And what I did is I lined them up with the hem at the bottom and placed them vertical, and then just folded the top edge down underneath, and I top stitched that onto the dress to create some of the details that Anna has in the bottom of her dress. After those are all sewn on, the bottom of the trim actually is raw, and so we need to finish the edge to make it so those don't fray. So I used the same single fold bias tape. I folded the one edge where I start, and then I sewed it all along the bottom of that hem, and it covers up all of the raw edges, and it gives a nice brown edge to the dress. I also went back and added the trim around the waist for a belt look instead of having a separate belt that would get lost in our dress up box. But I don't have a video of that. I decided to do that later. But now your dress is done, and it's easy for kids to get on because they can button up the front. They can even just button up part of it and keep the skirt open if they want more movement. But it's a perfect Anna's dress made out of 2 button-up shirts. It's really easy to make, and a lot of the details are already done for you since you're using a shirt. And thank you for watching this video. I can't wait to see the Anna dresses you make. Please share it with anyone who would love to make it, and I hope you have a wonderful day.